Today, we're going to talk about the PAX Good Behavior game and how that works very well and integrates with PBIS. My name is Mike Mumfer. First and foremost, I always like to start out and say that I'm a father and husband first. I have 3 children, Max, Zach, and Troy. Max and Zach are twins. You can see their ages there. I do not have 2 wives. 1 wife is enough. But speaking of my wife, she works in education, and she works at Johns Hopkins. She's a cultural anthropologist, and her specialty is disproportionality. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think when you incorporate both PBIS and PAX, you really get to some of the root causes of disproportionality and how we can begin to address disproportionality. If you're not sure what disproportionality means, in the educational sense, it is students of color and students receiving special education services being referred to the office or suspended at a higher rate than white students. And this is a national problem. So I really truly believe that PBIS and PAX working together can help address it. It's not going to solve the problem, but it can definitely help address that problem. So a little bit about myself professionally. I am the lead specialist on student behavior and school climate at the Maryland State Department of Education. Prior to that, I was the PBIS coordinator for Montgomery County Public Schools, which is the largest school district in Maryland. It's just north of Washington, D.C. Did that for about 3 years. Prior to that, I worked at Johns Hopkins University, where I was a school climate specialist, and also a PAX Good Behavior game trainer. That's where I got my experience using PAX and training in PAX. And prior to that, which I think is probably the most important thing on the slide, is that I was a classroom teacher in Baltimore City for 10 years. And I have used PAX and PBIS in my classroom. And interestingly enough, when I first started, for about the first 5 years, I did not use PAX and PBIS in my classroom. So I have some experience of what it's really like with and without it in the classroom. And also part of my teaching experience in Baltimore City, I was a classroom and behavior management coach in Baltimore City as well. So next here, you can see that I am a PBIS geek. This is actually my family's PBIS matrix. We have taught our children, our sons, this. We have 3 core values, which is all about respect. It's respect ourselves, respect family members. And I put in respect property because my wife and I paid for most of this stuff. And so I want to make sure that we keep it there. And you can see the different categories of which I categorized our PBIS expectations and behaviors. So again, I am a PBIS geek. So how can we combine these 2 things, PAX and PBIS? I've worked in many schools where I've been told that, oh, we don't do PAX because we do PBIS, or we don't do PBIS because we do PAX. And which is interesting is that these 2 programs really work well together. Right? We want to integrate these 2 evidence-based interventions, and that's key. They're both evidence-based interventions. So if you look at PAX, PAX is basically a school or a classroom system that is teaching the students self-regulation and self-control. Or if we look at PBIS, PBIS is more of a system. It's a framework. And its whole purpose is to support staff in fostering a positive learning environment for all students. We're going to come back to that a lot, that PBIS is just the framework. There really isn't a practice to it other than having expectations and reinforcing behavior. And that is where PAX comes in, right? Because PAX is really about the students. And to me, PBIS is really about the adults. So again, it is the shared vision. Both programs, PBIS and PAX, want a positive school and classroom environment. And like I said earlier, PBIS is really more about changing adult behavior. And then PAX helps the students be active participants or change makers in their ownership in the change process. So we're, again, talking that PBIS is that framework and PAX is that student resource. So I always like to start this with anything, any of my classroom management trainings or any PBIS or PAX things. And it's always, I get what's the silver bullet, the magic fairy dust. Well, it doesn't exist. You can't make kids learn or behave. You can't make someone do that. But we do have the power to increase the likelihood that they will by creating a positive environment. And both, when you put PBIS and PAX together, that makes it a lot easier. And that leads us to classroom management. First of all, I do not like the term classroom management because, like we said earlier, you can't manage other people's behavior. To me, a more accurate and better definition is teacher self-management of instructional practices in a group setting. I say it's better and more accurate because I made up the definition myself, but it really is about how you manage your behavior as the teacher and your instructional practices, which is behavior management, in a group setting, because we're dealing with, lots of students. In order, though, to implement PAX or PBIS, I think you have to agree on these assumptions. The behavior is learned, it's teachable, it's definitely affected by the environment. Because it's learned and it is teachable, that means it's changeable. But whatever that behavior is, whatever that student or the adult does, it's more likely to continue if it's effective for that person, efficient for that person, and is reinforced by the environment. So that's kind of what we're going to really talk about. Because if a child doesn't know how to read, what do? We teach that child. If a child doesn't know how to swim, right, we don't throw them in the water. Of course, I did that with my twins, and then I had a Sophie's Choice moment of who do I save first? They were both right there, and I was able to grab them both. But it's not a good way to teach someone to swim. You have to teach it. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we pray. No, we teach. And if a child doesn't know how to behave, what do? And we like to say that we teach, but oftentimes we punish. Punitive discipline is not going to change behavior. You can't punish out behavior. We need to get back to the teaching component of behavior. So that's, to me, where the framework comes in, PBIS. Now, PBIS goes by a lot of different names you may have heard of. MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. RTI, Response to Intervention. School-wide Positive Behavior Supports. Multi-Tiered System of Supports for Behavior, et cetera, et cetera. They're all pretty much the same thing. It is a framework. It is a tiered framework for enhancing and adopting and implementing a continuum of evidence-based interventions for students to achieve both academically and behaviorally important outcomes for every single student. It's not about categorizing students. It's about having a framework where we can reach the continuum of the needs of all of our students. Another way to say that is with the PBIS implementation framework, and that is providing or organizing our resources through multi-tiered mapping and gap analysis. We want kids to get help early, right? And those actions are based on outcomes or data, not procedures, right? And we're going to do stuff that's likely to work. We only want to use evidence-based interventions, like the PAX Good Behavior game. And then we're going to provide some supports to make sure we're doing it right. There's lots of fidelity measures within PBIS and PAX. And then we want to also make sure that you're supported, right? If you're implementing PBIS or PAX, you need to have some coaching and support. You need to have some progress monitoring and performance feedback, right? This is kind of what we're all about. This is the implementation framework. And if you're familiar with PBIS, you know the triangle, right? I can't not show a triangle in a PBIS presentation. So what this PBIS triangle basically is showing you is that you need to have a primary prevention or school-wide or classroom-wide system for everyone, for the students, the staff, and in all the settings. If you implement that right, you should get about 80% of your students to follow along perfectly. But then there's some students that need some extra help, around 15%. That's kind of your tier 2, where we're going to provide some specialized group systems and group interventions. And then you get the tier 3, which is those students that need highly individualized systems for high risks and behaviors. So that's kind of what PBIS is. If you want to think about it like this is stolen from the medical field. This is basically triage. This is how the CDC puts out vaccines, right? They put out a vaccine for everyone. They expect about an 80% success rate. Then they have things in place for those tier 2 and tier 3 cases. This is the way I like to break it down, because a lot of times I'm working with classroom teachers, and those classroom teachers follow this framework every time they teach, right? They give a lesson to the classroom, be it, they differentiate their instruction, of course, but there is a common theme to that lesson. After that lesson's delivered, those teachers assess it. Hopefully they get around 80 to 90% of their students, understand the lesson, and they move on. However, there's going to be about 5 to 10% that need some extra help. Teachers often form small groups, do some small group instruction with those kids. And then from there may be 1 or 2 kids that need some really specialized individual supports. That's called teaching. That's what we do every day. All PBIS is saying is do that exact same thing, but for behavior, right? We're going to implement that tier 1 PBIS universal expectations, the PAX good behavior game. That's for everyone. Then we're going to have some things in place for kids that need additional supports. And we're going to have things in place for kids that need serious one-on-one interventions. There are 10 critical elements to PBIS. We're not going to go over all of these during this webinar, but there are 10 critical elements to PBIS, and you could read them there. PBIS really focuses on having the school-wide expectations, a list of 3 to 5 specific expectations, and those expectations should be in line with whatever the school's mission statement is and what they expect their students, the faculty, and the families to kind of follow along, right? But again, it's not just about having school-wide expectations. You need to teach those expectations, and this is where PAX comes in. PAX is a great tool to help teach and reinforce those expectations. This is where we're going to use our PAX cues, our kernels. Our PAX most wonderful school vision is a fantastic way to teach and reinforce those expectations, right? Using PAX is going to make it easier for their students to generalize. Just like they generalize PAX and spleens, using PAX is going to help those students generalize those school-wide expectations in every environment within the school. So like I said earlier, you can't just have these expectations. You have to teach them. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got as a new teacher was I needed to start to think student misbehaviors as learning errors. When I was first teaching, I was being observed, and my assistant principal said, Mike, you're very patient when kids make mistakes when it comes to their academics, but you're not quite as patient when it comes to misbehavior. And he really sat me down and said, you have to treat it the same way. These are just learning errors, right? So if a student makes a mistake in their math, I reteach their math. If a student makes a mistake in their reading, I reteach their reading. If a student makes a mistake in their behavior, I need to make sure I reteach that behavior. And then there's where we can, again, use those PAX cues and kernels in combination with my expectations, right? So we can say, for example, you are being safe in the hallway, right? That's one of our PBIS expectations, is to be safe. Where? In the hallway. How? By using PAX hands. That's PBIS and PAX working together. You are respecting your learning by using PAX voices, or you're respecting your peers, because that's an expectation of our school at PBIS, to be respectful. Well, how do we be respectful? One way is by using PAX voices, right? Using these cues and kernels is going to help those students generalize that behavior, which equals less reteaching and less loss of instructional time. Here's a great chart to reference. If you already have your PBIS expectations and you're incorporating PAX into it, here's a great way. A very common PBIS expectations are respecting yourself, others, the property or environment, and learning. Here's some cues and kernels that you can use that show respect. So for example, to respect yourself is being a PAX leader and using toodles. Right? You could see from here, there's a lot of different ways to incorporate the cues and kernels within your PBIS expectations. And creating that common language, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. If we're a PBIS school and we incorporate PAX, put those together. If we're a PAX school starting PBIS, we can use both of them integrated together to keep that common language. And again, when you get down to PBIS is school-wide, but also PBIS talks about having classroom systems. Within those classroom systems, we need to teach our routines. This is, again, where you can use your PAX quiet, your PAX beat the timer, or any other cue or kernel, PAX cue or kernel, because this teaches your system. This teaches your routines to have in place. A great way to do so in PBIS, you're supposed to set forth your classroom matrix, your classroom expectations. One of the best ways to do that is to do the PAX vision, right? The My Most Wonderful School, the see, hear, feel, do more and less of. This is where they learn PAX and spleens. This is where they learn what the expectations are and some non-examples. Using both of them together to create your PAX vision is also your classroom matrix. So why is this important? Why do we need to develop this system for teaching appropriate behavior? Right? The first and foremost is this creates a safe and predictable environment. That's one of the main reasons why when I work with teachers, it's all about setting forth expectations and having routines. We want them to feel safe. If you can predict what's going to happen next, you're less likely to engage your amygdala. And that kind of gets to the next 2 points, is that having these routines, having these systems in place helps allow for prefrontal cortex activity and disengages the amygdala. When that amygdala is disengaged, now we can foster our authentic relationships with our students. We also, though, need to be very careful that some students' amygdala triggers are quicker than others. Some students' amygdala triggers are quicker than others, such as exposure to trauma, genetics, developmentally appropriate lessons, nutrition. There's a whole lot of different reasons. But one of the things we want to do with PAX is figure out a way, can we teach self-regulation and deter that amygdala activity? Well, there is a way. It's PAX. So we're going to incorporate PAX within our PBIS, right? Because PAX expands on just posting those expectations. It increases the recognition, right? That's what we want. We want to recognize the behaviors. PAX is going to help those students internalize the PBI's behavioral expectations. It's going to help them develop a deeper understanding of behavioral expectations. And when they need to make those quick judgments about those behaviors, that they make sure those quick judgments are consistent with the school's expectations, right? We need those PAX cues, kernels, and the PAX game to help us with our expectations and how to recognize, because that gets us to our next point of PAX and PBIS recognition. Right? We both programs want to positively recognize the desired behavior. And I'm going to get to, there's a difference between rewards and recognition, but you can see the ways that PBIS and PAX recognize the positive behavior within students. PAX uses some granny wacky prizes, the toodles. PBIS uses tickets and school-wide events, though we have to be very careful with those school-wide events that they're not exclusionary, that they're inclusive. We need to make sure we're doing that correctly. Speaking on some of those classroom systems, I just want to point out that these systems, these color-coded charts and the stoplights in Class Dojo are not PBIS practices. There's a common misconception that these are PBIS interventions or classroom systems. They are not. PBIS is adamantly against these systems, right? Because there is absolutely no evidence to support that it works. Right? If it worked, then we wouldn't need any of these things. I always ask schools that use these systems, are the same kids always on red? Every time I ask that question, I get the answer, yes, the same kids are always on red. Doesn't that mean it doesn't work? Right? All you're doing is keeping score of behavior. I want to try to change behavior. Would we ever use this concept for academics? I often say some of my most difficult times teaching in Baltimore City wasn't necessarily the behavior, it was the wide academic discrepancy. For example, one year I taught fourth grade, I had kids reading at a pre-primer level, and in the same class I had kids reading at a collegiate level, right? So that was a lot of there was a lot of academic discrepancy. Would I ever think to post reading levels publicly? Of course not. No one would ever do that. However, why do we think it's okay to do that for behavior? It is not. That is why PBIS does not condone the use of any of these color-coded stoplight systems for classroom management. We're all about increasing recognition, right? We want to create positive interactions with our students because every time we interact with a student, it is an instructional moment and everyone's watching. So we need to make sure we are in control of our own behavior and can manage our own behavior. So let's talk about the way PBIS recognizes students. Lots of times schools use PBIS tickets, right? The goal of these tickets is to force a positive adult and student interaction around a very specific behavior, and it's very immediate. It happens right away. PBIS tickets are not designed for mass distribution. Right? There's no, oh, we all did a great job, everyone take a ticket. That is not what PBIS is about. PBIS is not a participation trophy. Oh, I really like the way you held open the door for the kids. Let's all have a party. No, we want to recognize the behavior, but it's not a participation trophy. And it's also not used for bribery, right? It's not used correctly if you're saying to a kid, if you just sit still for 10 minutes, here's 10 PBIS tickets. You know what? Here's 50 if you can stay still for 20 minutes, right? It's not about bribery. Right, so the goal or the misconception of PBIS is this recognition system. Just want to put this out there for anyone who's not aware. Those tickets are not designed to change student behavior. Right? A piece of paper will not change a student's behavior. The tickets are designed to change adult behavior. The ticket is designed to prompt a conversation. Right? That conversation is where you build the relationship that gets to the behavioral change. Right? The goal, what really matters is that positive social engagement, right? Making sure you know your students of how to recognize them, right? That's why we often say we put the expectations on the ticket. So we know we're very specific. Hey, that was a great job the way you helped your classmate through with his math work. That was very respectful and I appreciate it. That conversation eventually changes the behavior. The ticket does not. So the whole goal of the ticket is to have the conversation, the specific conversation with the student. So another way to build on these is some great intrinsic motivators, right? That's where we incorporate our grainy, wacky prizes. So when we're getting the behavior, the expected behavior, we can use those tickets, but we can also use the grainy, wacky prizes, use them both together, right? And the wonderful thing about the grainy, wacky prizes, they don't cost any money. And again, you can use these granny prizes anytime. It's not just for the good behavior game. You can use these anytime that you feel you want to recognize student behavior. Another great way to recognize student behavior is when they recognize each other, and that is toodles. Right? That's PAX toodles. That's what PAX toodles are all about. Right? That's the opposite of a tattle. Right? It's a written compliment, and it could be given across from peer to peer, adult to student, student to adult, adult to adult. It's basically for anyone. This is now teaching kids, not only are they being recognized for following the expected behavior, they're recognizing themselves, they're recognizing their peers, their teachers. This is really building that school climate and that school culture. And again, all that matters with all of this, the PAX Toodles, the Grainy Wacky Prizes, the PBIS tickets, all that matters is having a positive social interaction and acknowledging the behavior very specifically. And again, the whole goal of these tickets is to build the relationship. The right way to give a ticket is to recognize the behavior. So you need to talk with the student where the conversation's tied to the expectation. You tell the student what you observed and why you're recognizing them. And again, knowing that it's the conversation that builds the relationship that eventually modifies the behavior, not the ticket. Just want to stress that. It's not the ticket that's going to change the behavior, it's the relationship. Again, some other ways to build great relationships is through close proximity, appropriate touch of high fives, fist bumps, using granny wacky prizes, appropriate facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, open-ended positive questions with active listening behind it, empathy statements. The goal of both PAX and PBIS is to build relationships with your students. So what about when it comes to discipline? What do we do when kids don't follow the expectations? Right? We're going to use PAX. We're going to reteach those expectations, but some students need a little bit more. right? That's when we get into our tier 2 and tier 3. This is why you need the framework, which again, that's all PBIS is the framework in which to incorporate PAX in its multi-tiers and any other interventions at its multi-tiers, right? PBIS is that plan of action. Want to point out, if you go to exclusionary discipline, it will not change that student's behavior. In fact, there are many studies that show it will actually increase that negative behavior, right? So when you have students that aren't responding to your tier 1 practices, your classroom systems, your school-wide systems, you need to investigate further. Maybe a quick FBA, knowing the difference between avoidance and attention. And oftentimes, avoidance is an academic issue rather than a behavioral issue, but not always. And then having the resources to put in those tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. I've listed below some very common tier 2 and tier 3 interventions that you can incorporate within your PBIS framework. This is a great visual to kind of summarize exactly what we're saying. PBIS is the umbrella, it's the framework, it's the system for your school to put forth all those amazing practices you do with your kids. Right? That's where PAX goes: counseling, restorative justice, school mental health, school teams, SEL, sports teams, after school programs, assemblies. There's a whole lot of everything you do, mediation. All that you do, just incorporate that within your PBIS framework, where you're using data, you're using evidence-based interventions to support and meet the needs of all of your students. Here are some additional resources that you could access: thegoodbehaviorgame.org, PBIS.org, PBIS Maryland, PBIS apps. Thank you very much.